Welcome to the last screencast in a 4-part series on organic molecules. This particular screencast covers nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are the largest molecules in the body and can consist of hundreds of thousands of atoms strung together. DNA, which is the genetic material found in the nucleus of cells, is an example of a nucleic acid. DNA is hereditary information that is passed on from an organism to its offspring, and it is the blueprint a cell follows to produce proteins. RNA is also a nucleic acid and is also involved in the production of proteins within the cell. If you continue on in biology, you'll get to learn all about how the cell uses DNA and RNA to produce proteins. But for the scope of this class, I'd just like you to know that these molecules contain the genetic information, that they are nucleic acids, and that they are found inside of the cell. Basically, a nucleic acid such as DNA or RNA consists of thousands of smaller subunits known as nucleotides that are strung together. With proteins, we talked about the fact that they are long chains of amino acids hooked together. It is the same idea with nucleic acids. They are long chains of a smaller molecule, known as nucleotides, that have been hooked together. If you look at the picture on the right side of your screen, we have an artist's representation of a nucleotide, or one of the subunits that make up nucleic acids. All nucleotides have the same basic structure, just like all amino acids have the same basic structure. All nucleotides have this structure that you can see here. Basically what you've got is a phosphorus group, which is a molecule that contains phosphorus, attached to a sugar or a carbohydrate that you can see here, attached to a third molecule which is known as a nitrogenous base, and basically that's just another molecule that contains nitrogen. It's this basic structure that makes up a single nucleotide. In the case of nucleic acids such as DNA and RNA, what we have are thousands of these smaller nucleotides strung together to make a very large molecule, or what's also known as a macromolecule. Adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is a molecule in the body that shares the basic nucleotide structure. If you look at a molecule of ATP, which is visible here, you'll notice that it has 3 phosphate groups, 1, 2, 3. So 3 of these molecules that contain phosphorus. They are attached to a sugar, a carbohydrate, which is known as ribose, and then the ribose is attached to another molecule which is known as adenine that is a nitrogenous base, just basically a nitrogen-containing molecule. It's actually this structure that ATP gets its name from. So you'll notice that we've got this adenine attached to ribose, and those 2 molecules hooked together are what are known as adenosine. And then when you attach 1, 2, 3 phosphate groups to adenosine, you've got adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. The importance of ATP is it is the energy source for your body. If you think about a car, it runs on gasoline. ATP is the gas for your body. We power everything we do, muscle contraction, thinking, digestion, everything, using energy we get from ATP. We can do this because energy is stored in the chemical bonds between the atoms of an ATP molecule, and if you break those chemical bonds, the energy is released. This is, by the way, how your car works as well. You get the energy to power your car from breaking down chemical bonds in gasoline. So how does this work? Well, if we go back to this ATP molecule, what we actually do is we're able to break off this outermost phosphate group. When this happens, the energy that was stored in the bond is released, and our bodies are able to capture that energy and use it to power all of the activities that we do. Now, if you've broken a phosphate group off of ATP, you now have adenosine attached to only 2 phosphate groups instead of 3. In that case, we have a new different molecule with a new different name. The molecule is now adenosine diphosphate, or ADP. And so you can then probably guess what adenosine monophosphate, or AMP, would be. The big idea is simply that each time we break off a phosphate group, we take the energy that was stored in the bond and use it to power a process in the body. So what happens to ATP once it has broken off a phosphate group? Well, the body will recycle it. It will reattach another phosphate group back onto the ADP to turn it back into ATP. If energy is stored in chemical bonds and released when chemical bonds are broken, that means that the opposite is true as well, that if you are reattaching phosphate to ADP, you've got to supply energy that will then be stored in the bond. So where does the energy come from to reattach phosphate? It actually comes from breaking down glucose, and that is why carbs are necessary in our diets and why, way back in the carbohydrate screencast, I mentioned that carbohydrates are the primary source of energy for our bodies. This process where we break down glucose to take energy from that molecule and use it to attach a phosphate group back on to ADP is known as cellular respiration, and it occurs within our body's cells. I've included an additional slide in this presentation that I wouldn't include if we were looking at this material together in lecture, simply because I would draw it on the board. But since we aren't together and I don't have a board, here's an overall picture of what this process looks like where we break down ATP and then regenerate ATP so it can supply energy again in the future. If we start over here on this diagram, we're starting out with a molecule of ATP. What the body will do, as we've talked about, is actually break off the outermost phosphate group from that ATP molecule. When the body does so, the energy that was stored in the molecule is released, and we're able to use that energy to capture that energy to power activities that the body is needing to do. Once we've broken off that outermost phosphate group, we now have again adenosine that's attached to only 2 phosphates instead of 3, and in this case the molecule is then referred to as ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. Our bodies are always as efficient as possible. So once we've created that ADP, rather than just getting rid of this molecule as a waste product, we're actually going to regenerate it or recycle it by attaching or reattaching a phosphate group back on. Because in this case we're actually making a chemical bond, that's going to require energy, and so the body has to use energy from another source to reattach that phosphate group. The way that it gets energy to reattach phosphate is by breaking down glucose within the cells. So there are a lot of chemical bonds in the molecule glucose, and as our body breaks those bonds apart and breaking down glucose, it's able to capture the energy that was stored in the bonds between glucose atoms and use that to attach a phosphate group back onto ATP. Once we've done that, we've now got a molecule of ATP again, which we could then use by breaking off its outermost phosphate group to get some energy released into the body, which our bodies can capture to do the work that needs to be done. And again, this energy that's being released from the phosphate group that's broken off originally came from the glucose that our bodies broke down. And then, of course, the cycle can repeat over and over again, and that's why carbohydrates are necessary in the diet. This concludes the screencast on nucleic acids.